Gardner speaks of 7 types of intelligence in his book, and he specifies logical mathematical intelligence, linguistic, spatial, musical, kinesthetic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. In a second edition of the book, he added 2 more types of intelligence, naturalist and existential intelligence. So whatever we touch upon today is not going to be enough to describe what the design of intelligence means. And when we picked this topic, we were not aware of the breadth of projects and ideas that are part of intelligence. So I'm going to only pick on a few of those that we believe are relevant for the class. So Howard Gardner is one of those fathers of intelligence, or one of those important figures that discuss intelligence. And the other one, of course, whom we'll meet later today, is Marvin Minsky. And Marvin Minsky is one of the forming fathers, and I say one, there were about 5 forming fathers or godfathers of artificial intelligence. Marvin states that artificial intelligence is the intelligence of machines or software, as well as a branch of computer science that studies and develops intelligent machines and software. Major AI researcher and textbook define the field as the study and design of intelligent agents, where an intelligent agent is a system that perceives its environment and takes action that maximizes its chance of success. John McCarthy, who was a colleague of Martin, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about John as well, coined the term in 1955 and defined it as the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. So let's start with the design of logic. There are, as I stated, various definitions of intelligence, one of which is logic. And let's go through logical and mathematical intelligence and understand what the roots of that are. So the idea behind this presentation is basically to take you from Charles Babbage's difference engine from the early 1820s all the way to the Blue Gene, which is the strongest known parallel computer system in the world today, based on in the National Laboratory of Argonne. It has speeds that are in the petaflop range. Petaflop is 10 to the power of 15 floating point operations per second, which is incredible in terms of processing power. And really comparing that to one of the first computers that were ever invented, the difference engine, which we'll touch upon, invented by Charles Babbage, that could store 1 decimal number in each of those columns that you're seeing. Of course, the design, the physical design of these machines is completely different, and the processing power obviously is completely different. What happened between those 2 periods in terms of design and in terms of the evolution of scientific theories of intelligence? So first, notions of intelligence started from ways of counting things. Counting could be represented in different ways. One of which was the abacus that you're seeing here on the left slide and the right side of the image. Arithmetica is structuring an algorist on the left and an abacist on the right. And they're competing to resolve an arithmetic problem in 2 completely different representational systems. One is using symbolic notations, that is algebra, that only took its place in the 16th century, and most of the calculation and the computation of that time was done through an abacus. So the earliest abacuses date back to 1960. This particular one is from China, a painted abacus that's made of limestone. The more ancient versions of these abacus calculating machines or calculating trays were stones that were just placed in the sand and moved from one place to another. Next. There are incredible notations, if you look online and in the libraries, incredible notations of these counting trays or calculation machines. The soroban is one of them. It's an abacus that was developed in Japan in the 1600s in the Wasan text. And the Wasan text is actually still used today. You can still find people in Japan traveling the trains and looking at those books. The Sangaro tablet on the right contains puzzles, geometrical puzzles, that were placed in temples and shrines. People would use them as games and would ask questions of solving certain mathematical or geometrical problems in the church then, in the shrine or in the temple. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that they were hanging those calculations and queries about different mathematical and calculation problems in such romantic ways on the trees. Those were called sangaku, tablets, votive tablets in Japan, in one of the shrines called the Jinja Shrine. So from here to there, so we're moving from the early 1400s in the Far East to 1642 in Europe. And in 1642, we're starting to see the appearance of gears in calculating machines. And so, this slide, I may have screwed up the slides, but in any case, this was called the Pascal calculator. Pascal invented it as a calculation machine with gears that could add and subtract two numbers directly and multiply and divide by repetition. The gears were placed here, and the representation system, much like a personal computer, was at the top. So calculation was at the bottom, representation was at the top. There was a stylus that was used to move these wheels around, and depending on their interaction, the calculation would be done internally. So the next slide shows the internal structure of Pascal's calculating machine. And here you see it inside. So this is where all the calculation happened, and a representational system with the digits was at the top. The stepped reckoner, which is an interesting name for a later version of this operator, was invented by the German mathematician and also philosopher Leibniz, that unlike Pascal's calculated, performed all arithmetic operations, so addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division in one machine. And one would basically have to crank that machine a little bit like the difference engine, which we'll see in a minute, to get those different gears interacting with each other and produce the calculation result. Incredibly designed and well-designed machines, as you can tell, using the best metals there were. So the level of craft at the time was just incredible, and almost like a musical instrument, like a piano, you could see all the various parts that computed the algorithm or the type of the calculation that was being done. So here are a frontal and isometric view of the reckoner by Leibniz. It used a particular technology that was called the Leibniz wheel. It has an interesting array of those values that are placed in the motor that allowed it to calculate, basically to connect all of the different parts of the machine together. And here we see in the position shown, the counting wheel meshes 3 of 9 Leibniz wheel teeth. So it's counting every third teeth. This is 1, it's skipping 3, 2, and 3. The input section has 8 dials with knobs to set the operand number, a telephone-like dial in the right, which is right here, to set the multiplier digit, and a crank here on the front to perform the calculation. The result appears in 16 windows on the rare accumulator section. So these machines were early versions of the difference engine, then later developed by Babbage. The problem with these machines, Pascal's machine, Leibniz's machine, was that there were still errors appearing in the calculation. And Babbage's dream was to come up with a machine that would completely omit errors altogether, and you could just keep on calculating continuously. So 1823, Babbage invents the difference engine, or starts inventing the difference engine, which took several iterations. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that there were several designs. This was difference engine number 2 that was designed between 1847 and 1849. It was an automatic mechanical calculator designed to tabulate polynomial functions. So each of these columns would store 31 31 digit numbers, and depending on the connection between the gears, one could add up numbers in connection with those gears. So again, a cranking mechanism that would calculate the problem by hand, manually. So this is just a plan for one of the columns. And what was interesting is that the engine generating pages and pages of logarithmic tables and also inscribed the output, the printing tables, or the history of the printing tables on a soft material that allowed one to return to these calculations and look at them basically as a kind of a biography of those calculations that were done with the machine. You can see this looks like a telephone book. So Babbage kept trace of all these calculations, and one can go back and find them without any errors. Sad to note that Babbage never lived to see the difference engine. It was only constructed after his death. But interestingly, it was constructed from the plans that he had devised, drawings that he had illustrated by hand, and was built one-to-one and worked perfectly. So next slide. So here are the details of the functionality of the gear. There were several, again, as I said, iterations of that engine. There was another plan for a general purpose automatic automata that Charles Babbage designed, which was another type of difference engine that used a rotational system rather than a continuous system. But here you can see how he designed all the interaction between the gears. And all these parts, as I said, were replicated one-to-one. The machine is operated by cranking the handle. With each cycle for the engine, the machine produces one result. Each crank turns the camstack. A camstack is one of those columns that we saw in the previous images that could store 31 digits. Determine the orchestration of the entire machine. The 31 numbers of the result end up in the very last column. And of course, various types of machines were then produced and designed that followed from Babbage's engine, or around the time of Babbage's engine. Various desktop mechanical calculators. It's funny just to note the names of some of these, some from the top left: an arithmometer, a comptometer, a Dalton adding machine, a Sundstrand, and an Oddmeer arithmometer. And so, interestingly, all these machines had roughly the same look. So, a calculating tablet at the bottom and a representation machine at the top, or a representation slide at the top. Women used these mechanical calculators, and you can see there were special desks that were designed for the secretaries that were called comptometers at the time. There were magazines that were devoted to teaching women specifically how to use these machines, and these factories of women were called batteries, comptometer batteries, quite chauvinistic. And you can see how the tables were designed with this recess that allowed the rotation of the machine to fit ergonometrically with the woman who's typing into it. So we're moving up in the definition of intelligence. We'll end up with awareness, but we're starting with calculation. We're adding memory to calculation. We're adding environment to computing and memory, and eventually we'll add awareness and consciousness to that. So we're moving up in the sophistication of the machines. So here we've discussed calculation as part of Babbage's engine. What happens when we add memory to calculation? And the most exciting work in that respect was the automatic computing agent. And I'm so happy that Marvin made it. Hi, Marvin. Wow, you guys are early. Shall I just continue?
Yeah, we'll find a seat over there at the table.
Okay. There are drinks. There's Coke and water. And so Alan Turing in 1936 designs the automatic computing agent, the ACE, an early electronic stored program computer design. That was the first programmable computer first demonstrated at the UN National Physical Laboratory in December 1950. It was called the automatic computing engine because it was in homage to Babbage's difference engine. And note how similar the design of the machine is. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see additional images of the pilot model of the AC, and then later, much less aesthetically pleasing revisions of these machines that were translated in the National Physical Laboratory. So each of these cells could store, just go back one slide, yeah. So each of these cells could not only calculate but also store information as part. So we're adding memory into calculation, into Babbage's engine. And of course that built from the Turing test, the next slide. That was basically an abstract representation. It was not meant as a practical computation, but rather as an abstract representation of what a central processing unit does, what it looks like. We all know the Turing test, the states, the different states that are inscribed by the various representations of those numbers, two tapes that allow two tape movers that allow the tape to move to the right, to the left, with every state change. So calculation plus memory plus environmental awareness. So we're moving up in sophistication. And when we add environmental awareness, we're seeing one of the key projects that dealt with that level of sophistication was the homostat designed by Ashby in 1948. And I love these drawings of Ashby. So here you see he was inspired by Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection and the idea that better species or more fitted species would survive. He was interested in the idea that computation was not this solipsistic process. It was an open process that would allow to incorporate or connect between various machines and their environment. So here you see the beginning of sketches that talk about input and output, a central processing unit in the middle. And these are details from his own notebook. He designed it when he was 24 years old. And again, it exhibited behaviors such as habitation, reinforcement and learning through ability to maintain homeostasis in a changing environment. It consisted of 4 interconnected Royal Air Force bomb control units with inputs and feedback that were magnetically driven and filled with water potentiometers. In a way, it was the closest at the time that one got to the design of a brain. And of course, it was far from the truth, but in fact, it was a big step forward. This is a particularly exciting note from Ashby that he wrote in 1951. In exactly the same way as a power amplifier, we can get an amplifier for information. The designer gives up some of his control over the job, divesting that control or information or design into the machine. This has available great source of undirected information and is designed to convert it, not all of it, but by selecting from it, into a useful form. So if most of the design goes not into the job, but into the machine that does the job, and this relates to what we've discussed already in previous sessions about the design of fabrication, the design of representation, etc. We're designing processes rather than designing products. A beautiful and simple diagram from Ashby's notebook. Next slide. And from 1979, an introduction to cybernetics, a field which he made contributions to, big contributions to, and moved the field forward into the next level of, if we may call this intelligence, to that of calculation plus memory plus environmental awareness plus action. So the Theseus by Claude Shannon from 1950, we go to the next slide, was a magnetic mouse that was controlled by a relay circuit. It was one of the first AI projects he had created it in the 1950. Claude Shannon, as some of you know, is the father, one of the founding fathers of information theory. His thesis is considered one of the best theses in the history of theses. But you can see that the mouse was designed as this electronic organism that was placed in an environment. The environment was made up of 25 cells, and it would be trained to move about those cells, with this idea that learning was what happens when you combine knowledge and memory together. So in the next slide you can see, and this is from the MIT Museum, by the way, so you can go and check it out at the museum. But here you see the memory tests. The first test is pretty bad, and the last test is much better. The mouse has learned and memorized, and now can, the second time around, the third and the fourth time around, can find its destination much faster. Information is the resolution of uncertainty, Shannon states. Let's go to the next slide. So Marvin states that building a brain is unlike designing a mind. And we'll talk about this with Marvin in the conversation. The field of AI was founded on the claim that a central property of humans, intelligence, the sapiens of Homo sapiens, can be so precisely described that it can be simulated by a machine. And the question is that true? And how far can we push this? So the design of awareness, as we sort of move from calculation, memory, environment, and feedback, brought the field of cybernetics and the beginning of the dawn of AI. And of course, cybernetics was only part of the sources that influenced the field of AI. Not all of it, but let's talk a little bit about it because it had effect on the design culture as a whole. So if we go to the next slide, this notion of cybernetics that one can create a machine dates way back to mythologies of the Golem of Prague or Pygmalion's Galatea. Pygmalion is a sculptor who's designing a beautiful woman who becomes alive. And if you read the description in Ovid's Metamorphosis, it's just incredibly, incredibly beautiful. Jacques de Van Pinson designs the glided copper duck. The duck can sit, it can stand, it can quack, it can play in the water, it can even appear to eat and excrete food. This was 1738, the emergence of automatons. So we go to the next slide. Automatons were everywhere, especially in Europe, in decadent Renaissance Europe, 1770s. They were devices that were designed for not only, or not this time, calculation, but rather for entertainment. And you can find these incredibly sophisticated designs for machines that play music in this case, or that drum, or that create various musical tunes. So here, the machine itself was part of the automaton design. And Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, as we know it by Mary Shelley, 1818, an incredible piece of literature. This is out of the entire book, my favorite quote by far, so I will share it with you. My thoughts now became more active, and I longed to discover the motives and feelings of these lovely creatures. I was inquisitive to know why Felix appeared so miserable and Agatha so sad. I thought, foolish wretch, that was within my power to restore happiness to these deserving people. When I slept or was absent, the forms of the venerable blind father, the gentle Agatha, and the excellent Felix flittered before me. I looked upon them as superior beings who would be the arbiters of my future destiny. I formed in my imagination 1,000 pictures of presenting myself to them and their reception of me. I imagined that they would be disgusted until, by my gentle demeanor and conciliating words, I should first win their favor, and afterwards, their love. These thoughts exhilarated me and led me to apply with fresh ardor to the acquiring of the art of language. It doesn't get better than that, right? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Interestingly, these beings are here portrayed by Mary Shelley as beings that she wants to love. So artificial intelligence coined around the year 1955, the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. Inspired, of course, by the movement of cybernetics that was forming around 1948, Norbert Wiener comes out with cybernetics, or control and communication in the animal and the machine. And he claims that cybernetics is an intelligence that is built on feedback. That kind of discourse inspires immediately a lot of the discourse also in design and architecture. So for example, on the next slide, and first, sorry, I was ahead of myself, some projects that were typical of this theory: the Turtle by Gray Walter from the 1940s, a machine that uses electronic networks to exhibit rudimentary intelligence. This reminds us a little bit of the Roomba. Marvin also designed a turtle for a logo, and we'll talk about this later as well. John Hopkins' Beast from the 1960s, a self-charging machine that would basically look, its only function was to look for power. Once it found power, it connected itself to it, and then moved around the space and looked for power again. So the poetics of uselessness in AI. As I said in the next slide as well here, yes, this discourse of cybernetics affects biologists and architects. We can see Waddington is inspired by cybernetics, by the idea of feedback, and comes up with theories of the epigenetic landscape as a metaphor for biological development and environmental interaction, where the human expression is not only based on the DNA code, but it's also based on its interaction between that code and the environment. Beautiful drawings that inspired many architects later on, specifically Deleuzians, or those who were inspired by the Deleuzian theories. And in a different way as well, Cedric Price in 1961, who together with the avant-garde theater producer John Littlewood, came up with a plan for the Fun Palace, one of the most exciting projects of architectural history, in my opinion, an incredible diagram showing how the different functions change and are actuated according to environmental feedback. So this notion that a building is a machine in which to live in and can change its functions constantly was very much inspired by ideas that came from cybernetics. And of course later inspired the design of the Pompidou Center, next slide, that was heavily influenced by Cedric Price's Fun Palace. So Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers built Centre Pompidou with the premise of let's flip the building inside out, but also let's design a building that is multifunctional, that can change exhibition space to theatrical spaces, etc. That also later inspired other architects that were thinking along the same vein. We go to the next slide. There are many approaches to intelligence, and Marvin can speak to that better than I can. But one of them was symbolic, the symbolic representation of data, of information, of knowledge. And interestingly, and this is something that attracted me to a particular definition of intelligence, was how Marvin at the time was categorized or classified as a scruffy logician versus the neat logician that was here denoted to John McCarthy, and Marvin is smiling at the table. Researchers at MIT, such as Marvin Minsky, and here you see Marvin and John McCarthy, found that solving difficult problems in vision and natural language processing required ad hoc solutions. They argued that there was no simple and general principle like logic that would capture all the aspects of intelligent behavior. Roger Schenck described their anti-logic approach as scruffy, and scruffy is what we're after in design. Next. So Marvin once shared with us, this was in a different class, a saying that Push Singh, one of his previous students, a great mind, said, there are certain things that human beings can say that computers can't understand. Like, consider this statement. Can the people on the screen see the people watching the movie? Or the child of a good friend of mine who's looking at an airplane going up into the sky and saying to his dad, look, Dad, we're shrinking. These are things that computers today can't understand. And yet, it has inspired so many projects in art, in architecture, in this case in the film industry, The Purple Rose of Cairo, Woody Allen's masterpiece, in my opinion, from 1985, Mia Farrow, and I forget the character's name, I think it was Sylvia, correct me if I'm wrong, but she comes into the theater to fall in love with this actor who becomes alive, and she's developing this alternative reality, this love story that exists in her mind as this second life. Intelligence is then not about logic, and logic cannot be defined and discretized in those simple units that do a computation. It's much, much larger and much more complex than that. So if we go to the next slide. Another approach to artificial intelligence beyond the symbolic that was either a nifty or a neat symbolic system, or better yet, a scruffy symbolic system, was the sub-symbolic system, a system that was also known as the bottom-up embodied situated behavior-based system that was then later practiced and written about by Rodney Brooks of MIT, who then later became the CEO of iRobots and designed various and numerous projects that were inspired by AI theory. If we go to the next slide, Rodney Brooks stated that bottom-up embodied situated behavior-based or nouvelle AI was that AI that rejected symbolic AI and focused on the base engineering problems that would allow robots to move and to survive. Their work revived the non-symbolic viewpoint of the early cybernetics researchers of the 1950s and reintroduced the use of control theory in AI. This coincided with the development of the embodied mind thesis in the related field of cognitive science, the idea that aspects of the body, such as movement, perception, visualization, are required for higher intelligence forms, rather than simply mimicking something that we're doing top-down. This is Rodney Brooks and one of his first robots. Next slide talks about one of the most recent projects that came out of Rodney's work at iRobot was the Roomba. Does anyone own one? Yes, we have one. I own one too. Yeah. It's a robotic vacuum cleaner. It's a very stupid machine. It gets the work done, but it takes forever. Here you see the series of autonomous robotic, it's an autonomous robotic vacuum cleaner that was sold by iRobot in 2002. Here you see a representation of its movement. So completely random movements until it hits a wall, and then it basically changes its trajectory. Many artworks were dedicated to this by connecting an LED light and generating this next slide. Representations of the Roomba's quote-unquote intelligence. So the final slide, I think, or closer to the final slide, of course, there are other approaches that take us from awareness to self-replication. If a robot is intelligent enough and the robot's quote-unquote mind is intelligent enough, can that robot replicate itself? That has also spurred the RipRap movement, self-replicating and prototyping machines that can generate other machines that think, quote-unquote, think like them. And I'm saying this ironically. So next slide. Also talks about this notion of self-replication that was inspired by John von Neumann's Universal Constructor from the 1940s, a program that could replicate itself, and so on and so forth. And if a program is sufficiently fit, well, can it be designed and then later represented as a fabrication tool that Amazon would buy to get its industry completely automated? Is there the possibility of now converting self-replication from software to self-replication in hardware? And this is the last slide, there are a lot of questions that still reside in our minds that have still remained unresolved. Can intelligence be reproduced using high-level symbols similar to words and ideas? I think not. Does it require sub-symbolic processing? Should artificial intelligence simulate natural intelligence by studying psychology or neurology? Or is human biology as irrelevant to AI research as bird biology is to aeronautical engineering? Can intelligent behavior be described using simple, elegant principles such as logic or optimization? Or does it necessarily require solving a large number of completely unrelated problems? Whoever of you has a Siri, it's the iPhone 5, if you ask Siri, and I'm not sure if you know this, if you ask Siri, open the, open the pod bay doors, Siri replies, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And of course, this is inspired by Hal Kubrick's Odyssey 2001, and I wanted to end up on this note. So Irina, if we can play this 1-minute video from Hal that basically, I'd like to situate the next discussion with Marvin, basically asking what happened between Kubrick's Hal and the Roomba? You know, what went wrong in all these many years in which Hal was invented so brilliantly, so tragically, as you'll see in the following video, to this useless or useful, depending on how you see it, vacuum cleaner machine. So here Dave is trying to get out of the spaceship. If we have volume, that would be great. And he's asking Hal to open the doors. Oh, really sorry. I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that. What's the problem? This mission is too important for me to be jeopardized by you, Dave. So Hal apparently watched Dave speak about his will to disconnect Hal. Hal was, for those of you who have watched Odyssey 2001, hard for me to imagine who haven't, is wanting to disconnect Hal, and Hal is reacting against it by not opening the doors of the spaceship for Dave. So Hal is taking a decision against his designers or originators' requests for command. Anyway, I'm sorry there's such a, we don't have enough volume, but when you can, please watch this. It's one of the best films of all time. These films don't exist anymore. Okay, so I think with that, we'll move to Marvin. I'm so happy you came here to save us of the need to talk about artificial intelligence without you as architects and designers. But I think maybe if you guys could just turn your chairs to Marvin and me and myself. Marvin, do you want to stand or sit? for making a formal introduction to Marvin, simply because this is too precious a moment and I don't want to forget any details. Some of those are personal details that I've added to the introduction. Marvin Minsky is the godfather of artificial intelligence. He has made, this is from his website, many contributions to artificial intelligence, cognitive psychology, mathematics, computational linguistics, robotics, and optics. In recent years, he has worked chiefly on imparting to machines the human capacity for common sense reasoning. His conception of human intellectual structure and function is presented in 2 books, which you have the links for, The Emotion Machine and Society of Mind, which is also a title of a course he teaches at MIT, which some of you I know are taking. He received BA and PhD in mathematics at Harvard in 1950 and Princeton in 1954. In 1951, he built SNARK, the first neural network simulator. His other inventions include mechanical arms, hands, and other robotic devices, and the most awesome, useless devices I've ever seen. The confocal scanning microscope, the Muse synthesizer for musical variation for the Media Labers at our class, the Muse that had inspired Joe Key's synthesizer, and one of the first low-board turtles, a member of the NAS, NAE, an Argentine NAS. He has received the ACM Turing Award, the MIT Killing Award, the Japan Prize, the Rank Prize, and the Robert Wood Prize for Optoelectronics, and the Benjamin Franklin Medal. Isaac Asimov described Minsky as one of the only people who would admit were more intelligent than he was, the other being Carl Sagan. Marvin grew up with these friends of his. He grew up with Isaac Asimov and Frederick Paul and Arthur Clarke. He is a passionate lover of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. He grew up talking to people like Asimov and Heinlein and Clarke and got much from the love of science fiction. I first met Marvin Minsky without him knowing about this when I was 14 years old, and my mother, who at the time was completing her PhD late in life, she was working on expert systems at the time, took me to hear one of Marvin's talks, and the talk was a Word file that he scrawled through. It was incredible, and in that talk, I did not understand anything, but there was one sentence that stayed. This all was way beyond me at the time, and still. But there was one question from a student at the end of the lecture. The question I cannot remember, but I can remember the answer. The answer was jellyfish can't fly. And that answer has inspired a lot of my own work. Later when I applied to MIT in designing jellyfish that can fly. And the answer, of course, now when I know Marvin better and his theories better, I can allude to what the question was. But that love for questioning everything like a child, with the innocence and naivete of a child, the ability to ask questions like, are the people on the screen, can the people on the screen see the people who are watching the movie? As a completely intelligent statement is something that I connect Marvin with. And whenever I see and meet Marvin and we have meetings at the lab, he brings back that childlike sense of wonder to everyone he is around. So it's a huge, incredible honor, Marvin, to have you with us. Thank you for coming. I have a few questions prepared for Marvin as sort of starting points, but I'd actually love to have you start. If you have anything that you'd like to ask Marvin. There is no real structure to this conversation. We can talk about anything. Marvin, we're a group of designers and architects and also engineers that come from different departments at MIT. And the class is dedicated to design across scales, problem contexts, and disciplines.
Well, I have a lot of
And we can start here.
I I have a lot of answers, but I'm trying to find the questions that they answered.
We can also provide you with different answers for questions that you can ask.
Like, who is strong enough to take?
Oh.
These people boast about saving material by looking at this very small cap. And they could have made a couple of pegs stick out, but they don't understand that the torque depends on the length of the lever arm. Well, I love your collection of slides. But a lot of them reflect disasters of states. And one question that bothers me is, how many of you have read some Aristotle? And you notice if you read Aristotle that he sounds like a scientist or a philosopher from around 1850. And I forget when he was, he's around minus 1850. When was Aristotle? No one knows? What? Couldn't hear.
Minus 500.
Minus 500, a long time. So what went wrong? And certainly a lot of things went right. But science didn't develop very well because of what? And so one way of looking at history is saying, isn't it interesting that there was so little progress in 2,000 years? And what was it? Why did this happen? And so I think what we want to do when we look at history is say, well, what were the mistakes? And Mary presented a bunch of beautiful things, many of which were good. But for example, Ashby set things back by a few years because the homostat was a learning machine that had no memory. It became very popular, and so I think between 1945 and 1950, there was immense progress in just about every branch of science, except cybernetics and artificial intelligence. So we have to look at the history of things and ask, what were the great ideas that advanced things? I think John von Neumann was a good example of that. And Alan Turing, where people whose ideas were immensely productive. And then there were others like Ashby and Rodney Brooks. You can see his failures in the MIT Museum. But Brooks also designed machines that don't remember what they did. And so we wanted, I think it's important to look at history and ask, why was there no great advances in science between Archimedes and Aristotle and Aquinas? Who wrote the Confessions? You see little bits of modern thinking appearing in history, and they disappear again for hundreds of years. And, if you look, Augustine, if you look at the Confessions of St. Augustine, somewhere in the middle he starts talking about memory. And he makes up a theory that the way memory works is that you think of something, you have some connections to other things, and you can move to those. And if you try to remember something and you fail, a nice thing to do is to think around it, and maybe you'll get 2 or 3 other associations, and then suddenly you'll remember the name of the person you're trying to remember, and so forth. And if you look at Aquinas' description, Augustine's description, then you see that he sort of invented the language Lisp, which was one of the early programming languages. And at the end of that chapter, which is in the middle of Confessions, it says, well, this is what I think about memory. Who will take the next step and make a better view of this? And then the Great Confessions degenerates, and he starts inventing the Catholic Church and sets the rest of science back for 1,000 years. It's a wonderful thing to look in the middle of this book and see, here's this character with great new ideas, and suddenly goes away. Well, Rodney Brooks Turtle is an example of something that is very impressive, and it got hundreds of laboratories all over the world working on that, and set us back a few years. So whenever you see something, you have to try to guess, is this a step forward in history, or is this nice looking idea of the beginning of the Little Dark Age, which, if you're lucky, the Little Dark Age will only last 7 years. If you're unlucky, it might last 300. But I find it also scary to notice that Archimedes invented some calculus, and the manuscript was discovered not very long ago in the 1990s. The parchment that Archimedes had described how to find the volume of a cone. The volume of the cone is 1/3 area of the base times the height. Is in 1/6. Pretty clever. And then that was lost for a long time. I've lost the thread. Who has a question?
Did AI travel along dark periods between?
It hasn't had time to do as much, but it was very productive I remember when Alan Turing developed the first modern ideas about computers, pretty much. And that was in the early, the early parts of World War II. And those ideas got around and it spread fairly rapidly. Ashby's ideas got around and set things back, so it's sort of interesting to see how information can evolve things. It would be nice if we knew which of the current theories of physics are wrong, which are solid things down, and which are weak, and of course there's no way to tell. What's happening in architecture?
In architecture, we don't know. Some say that architecture is a dying discipline.
The appearance of incredibly strong materials is upon us, so we should start seeing strange structures that nobody ever imagined before, or everyone imagined but couldn't build.
Martin, do you enjoy Stata building?
It's nice to see the cracks going. I guess a confusing buildings.
Is a confusing building a good thing to have?
I don't know. When I was a graduate student at Princeton, the math department was a sort of two-story building, so we had a lot of offices on the second floor. On the first floor, it had a pretty large common room, and everyone was there a lot of the time. So you come in, and people would be sitting around talking and eating things, and Alonzo Church might be there writing equations on the board, and MIT, we had a big floor in Technology Square, and the whole floor was a single huge rectangle, a ring of offices around the outside, and a vast common room, and some architecture students came in and sort of divided, no walls in these centers, except for the elevator shafts and things. They made some sort of platform which didn't make any sense, but it had some function, and people would, again, it was, my experience was it was sort of, had been at Princeton, one big room with no architectural features, a giant rectangle with an incredibly intense collection of interactions between people. Eventually, the Rockefeller and Princeton got replaced by a higher, thinner structure with no social activity at all. Media Lab has become sort of huge and gross and three-dimensional, but no place where anyone gathers. And the result of making it a more attractive building with more public spaces and so forth has been that everybody stays home and types on their terminal. And if you come in there during the day, you can see a huge building with 3 people. So sometimes, I don't know about this building. I don't mean this building, I mean the Sabbath. I don't know if it functions, but my experience is that the important thing is an unencumbered large area where people can get together and argue and talk. We don't see much of that.
Maybe not, maybe.
I have a question concerning your interest in science fiction, because we always hear that there was a close link between yourself and Asimov and other writers. And I was thinking at the time, you know, what inspiration did you get from the science fiction writers? And maybe there was a reciprocal exchange between yourself and them. And then I was thinking, the science fiction genre seems to have shaped sort of the layman approach to artificial intelligence, both in terms of what it can bring, but also in terms of the risks that it might entail. And I was thinking, how do you think science fiction related to the work you did maybe back in the 60s or 70s, as opposed to how people look at it today?
Well, I've sort of summarized my feelings about literature by saying that general literature is mostly books about how 2 or 3 people get in each other's way and get along, conflict, and get into various troubles and tell lies, and sometimes these get resolved, and sometimes it ends up with everybody. In Shakespeare, everybody ends up dead. So general literature is about the silly mistakes that people make over and over again, the same plot repeated a million times. And science fiction is about everything else. So luckily, when I was a child, I read a few novels, and maybe 3 or 4. And then when I read the 5th one, I realized it was the same as the others. But when you pick up a science fiction story by H.G. Wells or Jules Verne or Aldous Huxley or something like that, you'd see a whole set of new ideas you've never seen before. If you pick up a novel, you see if there's somebody who does something bad and other people blah, blah, blah. It's always the same. So, science fiction is everything else. And, after a while, I ran out because Jules Verne was But then, all of a sudden, possibly about 10 or 12, Isaac Asimov starts appearing in pulp magazines, and somehow I got to meet those people, and that became my environment with scientists and science fiction writers. And I still eat them up because every now and then I have an idea that I've never seen before. Have you seen, how many of you have read a novel in the last year that had an idea that you hadn't? You get ideas from general literature. What's it about? It's a funny thing. People are very complicated. Mathematics is very strange because in mathematics, well, geometry is pretty complicated. There are about 8 or 10 axioms. In group theory, there's 4 or 5 axioms, and so forth. So the interesting thing is people consider mathematics hard, and I can't figure out. I find it hard too. But why is it that when you start with just 5 simple assumptions, group theory is very nice. Here are these objects, and they have, when you multiply 2 of them, you get a third, and each one has an inverse, and that's about it. And then you get this, after a while, you start with the towers of complicated things you can build, starting with almost nothing. So that's what mathematics is. In some sense, it's the simplest of all things, and yet people find it the hardest. And people don't have any trouble reading a novel where you have 5 people, each of whom are sort of crazy and complicated, and pull various things out of various facts. And none of them had to happen. They make no sense, and people find that easy. And it's strange. Why? It's an interesting question. The humanities are complicated and people like them. Mathematics is insanely simple, and therefore people find it terribly hard. Even I do too. But why is it? What's going on? Who has a question?
When I'm watching the sci-fi movie, or is another question about sci-fi. So when I'm watching the sci-fi movie, so I kind of sense there's like change. So when you're looking at the more old sci-fi movie, you see a lot of robots. Like a lot of how to say this, like representation of artificial intelligence. But slowly when you look at the more contemporary sci-fi movies, so slowly you see less and less robots, but more and more about like people putting chips in their body, and they become like more intelligent or more stronger. So I see there's a change between this kind of artificial intelligence and human augmentation. So what do you think about the relation between two things, and what do you think about this that human augmentation is part of artificial intelligence? And what do you think about it?
Well, I guess the robots in the modern movie are simplified people. So you don't have to worry about what their goals are, because they only have one, which is usually just to kill people or something. Trying to think of, are there any movies in which the robot's character is interesting? The Schwarzenegger is a masterpiece of how much you can do where the robot has only 10 words in the whole movie, and yet he sees the central character. So that's an interesting art form. Basically, Arnie must be very smart. In fact, he made an early movie about bodybuilding. And you remember that? I can't remember its name. What? Yes. And I remember it as a rather brilliant product, was it?
There was an interesting psychological window.
Yeah. I got the feeling from that Arnie was in fact a very smart and elaborate thinker. Making bodybuilding into the intellectual triumph is quite a triumph.
I guess sort of switching gears, because I read your paper on sort of your thoughts about music and how, and like sort of half of it went over my head and I kind of picked out a few things, but correct me if I'm wrong, sort of you think that, like let's say Beethoven's Fifth, like it has the tendency to stick with us because it does a good job at sort of being a teacher, sort of a similar way like music, you remember a tune or because it has a certain structure that sort of we could remember and interpret. I guess if you could sort of explain what your opinion of it, like why do we remember songs like Beethoven's Fifth or sort of Mozart's like simply sort of the well-known ones where people could sort of sit and hum it versus the sort of Ligeti or Bartok kind of more abstract.
Well, if you look at the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth, and think of it as how would you begin a story? He goes bubble, bubble, and if you didn't get that, then it goes bubble, bubble. And if you didn't get that, you go bubble, 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 and then he repeats that one step longer. And then the next 12 measures is to, well, 7 measures, is he does it on every step of the scale. And you're listening to that, it sounds pretty good, and you don't realize that he was playing his 4 notes on every step of the scale. And if he told you that that's what he's going to do, you would say, surely that's the most boring possible thing. And what's more, they're in order. He doesn't even skip one and come back. So within the first minute, he has given you a vocabulary of what to do with these 4 notes, and really just 2 notes. And then the next 20 minutes are showing you, look at all the more things you can do with this little figure. There's another one, maybe 2 or 3 more in the piece. And so why is this one the most popular, or why was it before modern music such a popular piece? And you could say it's because here's a piece of music where the guy is laying out, here's some things, and here's how you can put them together, and here's another way to put them together, and showing you new ways of looking at the same thing from 20 to 30 different points of view. My epigram for this is that in classical music, there's a rule, which is that if you repeat the phrase 3 times, you have to change it the 4th time. And that was 200 years ago, or 150, classical music had that paradigm that you don't repeat something more than 4 times. And it's still the same in modern music, except that the number is 64. If I turn the radio on, and it's something written in the last century, unless it's Cesar Frank or Debussy or one of those people, I have to turn it off again. Because they were reading it without adding in the melody. This must be bad for something. I don't have any evidence for that. I'm going to read off copies. Have you thought of asking why?
I have a question to push back a little bit on this. It seems that basically every song would be built on redundancies and repetition, and otherwise it would be it would be a song or a melody to start with on some symbolic level. So maybe how would we go about explaining why maybe the taste changes over time or cultural differences among which redundancies are put there? Do you have some thoughts on the more symbolic level of this? Thought?
I didn't quite get what you...
Yeah.
There are cultural differences, but one attitude is say, well, they each have their merits, and another is to say some cultures are really bad and they cause the brains of their victims to deteriorate. So just because there's a cultural difference doesn't make it all right.
Is that what you think is going on with, I guess, cultural music now, or like pop music now, when everything is super kind of formulaic and basic, I guess?
I guess I'm going to listen to it. I grew up in my father was a surgeon and he tied knots with one hand and he played conventions. And so I think I just grew up thinking that's what everyone does. I never got to be tied knots with one hand, but I grew up with 2 and 3 voice fugues in my head, and I can improvise 2 and a half voice fugues without much trouble. And if I try to add a 4th one, then the first one disappears. I feel sort of stupid. But I suspect most people can't even do 2 fugues at once, so I'm sorry for them. It's just a matter of luck. What environment you grow up in.
Do you think that the same thing has happened in architecture? Like, thinking most about architecture through history, like me personally thinking that architecture in the past was more interesting and as the use of mathematics completely changed. And now practical architecture seems to me that has been very simplified, where like also the repetition. Now it's just repetition of melody and
I don't have much feeling about that. It seems to me that as you develop stronger materials, then there is less constraint on what you can do with them. And does modern architecture exploit this? And standardity has all sorts of things like spiral staircases that go several floors without any reinforcement. And you couldn't have done that with bricks, I suppose. I don't know what to say. I'm not sure what architects are trying to achieve. And, what kind of what are you paid to do? Right? It's easier for people to interact with, to make them feel more comfortable so they don't have to do anything. What's the goal?
I have a question, kind of going back to Site 5, you mentioned the project to be some kind of consultant on 2001 Space Odyssey. So I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about that, and speak about the computer and about how is it machine.
That was so funny. My last conversation, Kubrick came over here when he was planning the movie and went all over the United States and talked to people because he wanted to know everything that was going on in technology and what people thought would happen in the future. So he certainly put due diligence into making that movie. Somewhat later, he developed a version to flying, so he never came back. I don't know what happened. When we started to make the movie, he invited me to come over for a few days. And it was remarkable because he had made this beautiful computer. Hal was a bunch of gadgets in it was sort of racks with modules. But the modules were gorgeous in different colors, and each one was a little this or that. And he said, what do you think of that? And I said, oh, it's very pretty. I said, well, what do you really think? Is it going to be that way in the year 2000? And I said, I am afraid not, because the modules, the computer can tell what's in the module by sending signals and things to the things in the back. And nobody's going to be looking at them, so they'll probably just be black things with a serial number on them. And he scrapped the whole set, and I thought really bad because his computer looked nice. And the rectangle, the alien was a pyramid, was a triangular pyramid. Have you ever seen a triangular pyramid? Or the tetrahedron? The people are used to, what do you call it, a four-sided pyramid? Is there a name? Yeah. So he was showing this, it was black, and he had a bunch of people coming looking at this monolith, which was a three-sided triangle pyramid. And one of the consultants was looking at it and said, I don't understand, what shape is that? And so when Stanley asked the other ones, and most of the people, there were about 7 people, and most of them didn't know what they were. You don't see triangular pyramids anywhere. All the Egyptian ones are, on square base. And the Iranians was actually puzzled. It took me a while to figure out what was happening because mathematicians are used to the simplest three-dimensional figures of triangular pyramid. So Stanley got disgusted and changed it to the slab. So in the last conversation, because he stopped traveling you were talking on the phone some years later, and you said, I'm just worried about the future, and I said, what do you mean? And you said, well, the Russians have 24,000 A-bombs, and the Americans have 52,000 A-bombs, and somebody's going to steal some, start a war, and everything will be over. I'm just very worried about this. And there was a long silence. And I said, well, who makes that movie for Dr. Strangelove, which explained this problem better than one could possibly explain it? There was another long silence. Oh, I forgot about that. So strange. So it was quite an experience. They wouldn't tell me the plot. They're just talking to Kubrick every minute. And while we're talking, we always went out of the 35mm camera. We really liked taking pictures. I couldn't believe it. Whatever happened, we take a picture of it. With his left hand.
To that end, at the beginning of the lecture today, Professor Oxman showed the slide where you, I think it was one of your quotes where you were describing AI and you said that it was agents taking in environmental stimuli and trying to find the most successful route, or trying to optimize success, I believe. But because do you think that HAL, the final result of HAL from 2001, fits maybe some of your ideas on what an AI would do? Because the whole reason HAL would kill off everyone else was because his maximizing success was to complete the mission, and HAL deemed everyone else as a threat to that. So I guess what do you think of HAL and how it fits in AI in general?
Well, if you spent $1 trillion making this great spaceship, and you wouldn't want people screwing it up. Yeah, the question is, why were there any people on the expedition at all?
I have a question. I was wondering what are one or two of the most influential science fiction stories that you've ever read, and I was wondering if any newer sci-fi authors are inspiring to you.
Say it again.
I was wondering one or two of the most influential science fiction stories you've ever read, and then if there are any new sci-fi authors you like.
I haven't kept up with the latest generation, but I think I got a lot of ideas from Asimov and Fred Pohl and Barry Bindi and Larry Niven. It just seems H.G. Wells, of course, and general literature just seems pointless to me. Once you've read 5 novels, then that always seems to be enough. These guys think. Their job is to get new ideas and not to present old ones in this it's a strange community. A lot of them are professors here in
how long do you think we will have
religion. So a remarkable phenomenon. How long will we have sports? I once found somewhere on the web, I found somebody in Australia had made a catalog of what percentage of people's time is spent on which things. And sports was fairly high, and how many hours per week do people do various things. I wish I could find it again. People don't seem to really care what they do with their time.
I'm wondering, sorry.
How many do you do of sport? It's probably good for your health. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the relationship between your teaching and your research, and whether you think the two should be combined, that the way that you teach and how you teach students is related to the research that you're doing, or whether they should be disentangled.
Well, I was unbelievably lucky because I came to MIT just at the time when the students knew more about computers than the faculty. Because the faculty had grown up in the 1940s with analog computers. So the digital computer hadn't quite arrived. There were only 2 or 3, a handful of them around the country. And for some reason, the Tech Model Railroad Club kids had gotten some of the early crude computers, some developed at Lincoln Labs, for example. And so that was a little community that were pretty advanced. And they had important projects like every year they'd go to New York and see who could find a route that included riding all of the subway routes in the fewest hours. So that was an annual contest. You have to write computer programs to optimize this, because there are a lot of possibilities. So when I got here out of graduate school, I inherited this crowd of students. And I forget what point I'm trying to make, but it was
Seems like
a
maybe the
golden
students
age
were
in which the
teaching.
kids knew more than the faculty did. And so I had a sort of leg up on the whole thing because I was sort of psychologically one of the children of the teachers. As I'm sure some of you are. And then there were all sorts of other bits of luck, like I had a professor at Licklider when I was undergraduate at Harvard, and when I got here at MIT, he had somehow gotten to be head of some part of the Office of Naval Research, and I needed some more memory for our computer. Since it only cost $1 million, it arrived in a few days. You could just be lucky, and everything worked out very well. Until about 1970s, when there was a great liberal Senator Mansfield, who as liberal as would, not the idea that really the Defense Department shouldn't be doing so much civilian research. And what he didn't understand, I think, is that the Defense Department was full of would-be scientists who were sort of bootlegging vast amounts of money into the civilian research groups. So every time we go to the computer, we'd ask them for one and we'd get two. That sort of thing. So then things slowed down. Now things are much more difficult because in my early days at MIT, any good student who wrote an interesting thesis related to computation could become an assistant professor somewhere, and they all did. And now they hardly ever do, and they have to go and start a company and get something to work in the next 3 years, and their capital is still already. It's not heading anymore. They need another big war.
Recently saw a DARPA video on a hummingbird that had been created that had flying technologies that allowed it to go back and forth and up and down and in circles. The actual drone.
And they can only fly for a minute because the batteries haven't. Batteries aren't as good as muscles yet.
At what point in the future do you see that sort of drone being able to mimic real life hummingbird?
Well, I have sad news, which is that the laboratories which had robots, physical robots, accomplished immensely less than the laboratories which had simulated robots. So I don't recommend that if you're interested in robotics that you buy a robot. Because it will break within 24 hours, and they'll fix it for you a couple of days. So if you have 6 students, they'll probably get to operate this robot for 20 days a year. But if you have a simulator, then each student can be simulating 10 robots at once. So it's very strange. Everybody who starts out in the area feels that they should have the latest real robot. And the result is they get no research done for a long time. Sort of paradoxical, because what people say is, well, if you have a simulated robot, then maybe you won't understand a slippery floor, or something like that. And so you get ideas that things will work which won't really work in the world. And my impression is that simply hasn't been true. And that usually, if you simulate a real world situation, you won't make fatal mistakes every day. Every now and then you might leave something out and get a wrong result, but it's not that every problem. And you have a robot?
Marvin, what would you work on for the next 100 years? Do you see researchers developing consciousness on a chip?
Yes, that's the big problem has been graduating from the simulation of AI programs that solve mathematical problems to ones that are pretty good at commonsensical problems. And this is because to work on a problem in group theory, you only need 5 or 6 axioms, and it's not hard to represent things. But, so far as I know, there's no robot, there's no AI program, or there was one, that understands why you can pull things with a string but you can't push them. The reason is that if you push a string, it will buckle, and Euler proved the theorem about that a long time ago. There's no common sense program understands such things, as far as I know. So that's an exciting area of research, but it's going rather slowly. The Watson thing at IBM might be a step forward, but I haven't seen enough details to know if they're on a good track. It's got a lot of smart people in the project.
But they're trying to figure out how a brain works, and that's not the right way to think about the mind, is it? By looking into the brain.
I think you can't figure out how the brain works till you have better theories of how it works. So I'm worried that we'll spend a few $1 billion collecting data on the brain, and if they make one mistake and don't measure the concentration of some particular chemical or potential strength of some membrane or heaven knows what, they'll have to do it all over again. So I would like to see them talking about simulating the nervous system of a house form until they can get one that actually does the right things, and then worry about the human brain. Otherwise, there'll be a small number of big projects, and that's not the way to get a lot of good new ideas. But you want a lot of pretty well-funded small companies. Do architects have research programs?
Other than, let's say, smart materials, housing, that kind of money, and I think one of the interesting things you brought up is how research in the simulated world is always advancing in the real world because of the physicality and the mechanics, and for architects, it's, even though we have the ability to actually produce lightweight composite materials in architecture, because of fire code or other kind of physical code-related issues about life safety, they can't be tested yet in the real world. So it stays in a kind of simulated or installation scale. And I think that's one question I would have about if the simulated world is always going to be more advanced than physical world because of the limits of physical constraints and mechanics, etc. Or there will be a time when, I mean, in that scenario, I can imagine we all live in just the simulated world, which architects thought would happen, and we would all live in a simulated environment versus the physical, but I guess the relationship between those two, because I think the simulated world affected directions in the physical development of architecture, but because it's physical, it always lags behind, probably around 20, 30 years.
I forgot to say that a lot of our earliest work was inspired by Nicholas Nebuchadnezzar and some of his students who made really crazy programs that actually worked, and none of the people dreamed of such things. And then there was zero bandwidth telephone, the picture phone thing, which was quite a crazy idea. Some architecture students program which was better than chance at telling whether the speaker on the telephone was frowning or smiling or whatever. I think it had 5 or 6 expressions, and it was better than chance than looking at the spectrum of the voice. What was the facial expression? So this was the zero bandwidth picture photo, and it was actually pretty good. You talked to somebody, and it had 5 or 10 pictures of that person's story locally, and it switched on the different faces depending on whether they were young or black and whatever. Who would encourage a student to do such a crazy thing? And you have this complicated thing with gerbils pushing blocks around in the sand. I don't remember what the point of that was, but it got people interested in doing everything. Those were the days. There was a civil engineer named Mary.
So do you think so when you say those were the days, so
Well,
what is in the future? What do you kind of anticipate with artificial intelligence or maybe the state of?
I keep worrying about setbacks where some well, I thought that Rod Brooks actually set back research from claiming that you could do high-level things without having abstractions. And so did Ashby. The fact was that Ashby's systems forgot everything. When he learned something new, it forgot the past. And so couldn't achieve very much more. It could adapt to the current situation pretty well, but it had no growth possibilities. And you can't blame them for that because we didn't have any real computers. Ashby gave me my first transistor, which I appreciated, and we have a guy here named Fred Webster and Donald Griffin, who were, this is 1950-ish, and they were trying to figure out how the bat catches insects. Bats fly around and catch moths and eating mosquitoes, although the nutrition for catching a mosquito is marginal. You can't actually survive it. But they couldn't figure out how the bat caught these insects. And it turned out with enough equipment, they discovered the bat actually can't tell whether the insect is using its ultrasonic radar well enough to catch it in its mouth. So it waits for it to hit the arm, which has a web, and then it can feel whether it is that way or it isn't. And my transistor was that Ashby had given me and made it to a little transmitter that was on the back with carbon moved its head and triggered cameras to take the picture. Anyway, I forget the point of all that.
That you miss the future.
I'm worried about the future because the universities are not growing the way population isn't growing. As I said at the beginning, almost all our students became faculty in the 60s and 70s, and almost none of them they will go to startups and work on something that I've got to show some promise within a year or two.
Marvin, but you propose to make humans smaller. So maybe that's a good solution.
It's sort of a joke.
Serious one.
Well, the Clark story that said of all years, it's story people use running around and
Storing people in computers is opposed to storing computers. That's a good science. Thank you so much, Marvin, for being with us.
Well, I'd like to hear what you all do.
And whoever wishes to stay for the next few minutes, please do so.
So next week, do we meet in the lab? Is that, okay, so next week we meet on the top floor of the lab in that space that we have the representation class for the private project.
Also, the question was, are you doing videos for the games?
I think it would be nice, but if you can't manage to do it, it's okay, but it would be nice if you can, so that there's a record and you can have it online. How many minutes do you have? I think, yeah. Or for the video, like a minute or two, but yeah, I think it'll be 10, 15 minutes, 10, 12 minutes. It's supposed to be a fun project, so don't stress yourselves out in a way that is no longer fun.
And also the ones that need help from the three of us, like Chare. I know Chare is helping some of you with the coding, and like just email us now because we won't see you before.